The day Eliza Caldwell's world cracked open like sun-baked earth was not the day her husband died. It was the morning a stranger walked into the Silver Spur Saloon, dropped a leather satchel heavy with coin onto the bar, and said he wanted to buy every single debt she owed. It was the autumn of 1873 in Cold Creek, Nevada, a town that had earned its name not from any generous spring, but from the bitter wind that rolled off the Sierra Nevada range each October, and cut through every coat, every wall, every bone with equal indifference. The town sat at the edge of a long valley where the grass had gone gold, and the cottonwoods along the dry creek bed had turned a shade of amber so rich it almost made a person forget how hard the living was out here. Almost, because Eliza Caldwell had not forgotten. She had not been allowed to forget, not for a single day since Thomas Caldwell had ridden out to check the eastern fence line 14 months ago and come home draped across the back of his horse, shot through the chest by men who had never been found and almost certainly never would be. Thomas had left behind 3 things: a 4-year-old son named Henry, a farmstead with a mortgage that was already 6 months behind, and a tab at the Silver Spur that Eliza had not even known existed until the morning after his funeral, when Reed Dalton, who owned the saloon and held more paper debts in Cold Creek than the bank itself, had come to her door with a ledger book and a smile that contained absolutely no warmth. Thomas had owed Dalton $83.40 in whiskey, card games, and what Dalton called miscellaneous lending. $83.40 might as well have been $800 for all Eliza could do about it. She had done the only thing she knew how to do. She had survived. For 14 months she had worked the saloon herself, not as a dancing girl. She had made that clear to Dalton on her very first day, and he had respected it, if only because she was the best cook within 60 miles, and he knew it. She cooked the meals that the Silver Spur served in its back room 3 nights a week, and she cleaned the establishment on Sunday mornings when it smelled of old tobacco and spilled spirits, and she kept meticulous track of every dollar she earned and every dollar she owed, writing it all down in a small brown ledger she kept beneath her mattress. She had paid down the debt slowly, terribly slowly, the way you chip at granite with a small hammer, and she had managed to whittle it from $83 to $51 and some cents in 14 months, which felt like standing at the bottom of a mountain and proudly announcing you had climbed 3 feet. Meanwhile, the mortgage on the farmstead had not stopped its own quiet march forward, and by October of 1873 she was 60 days behind on that as well. And the man at the land office, a pinch-faced fellow named Aldous Greer, had begun sending letters. She kept those letters in the same box where she kept Thomas's photograph in Henry's first tooth, because she had discovered that the most frightening things in life were best kept in one place where you could look at them all together and remind yourself that you were still standing. She was still standing. On the morning of October the 9th, Eliza rose before the sun as she always did, built the fire in the small stone hearth of the 2-room house that sat on the edge of the farmstead, and made cornmeal porridge for Henry, who ate it with the serious expression of a person who has more important matters to attend to and is merely tolerating breakfast. Henry was 5 now, with his father's dark eyes and a crown of light brown curls that Eliza kept trimmed as best she could with the pair of scissors she had brought from Missouri 6 years ago, when she and Thomas had come west full of the particular brand of hope that the young and the unbroken always carry. She braided her own hair, dark auburn, thick, always threatening to escape whatever she pinned it into, and put on her gray wool dress and her work apron and carried Henry on her hip the 3/4 of a mile into town, because the horse had thrown a shoe 2 weeks ago, and the farrier wanted $2 she didn't have. She left Henry with May Briggs, who was 70 years old, and kept a small house near the livery and watched children for whatever people could spare, and then she walked to the Silver Spur and began her day. The Silver Spur was not a glamorous establishment. Reed Dalton kept it functional the way a man keeps a plow functional, not because he loves the thing, but because it serves a purpose. The bar was long and scarred with knife marks and ring stains from 1,000 glasses. The floor was swept sawdust. There were 6 tables for cards and 4 for eating, and a small stage at the back where a woman named Loretta sang on Saturday nights, badly, but with such enthusiasm that the miners and cowboys who crowded in to hear her didn't seem to mind. The kitchen was Eliza's domain, a room barely large enough to turn around in, with a cast-iron range that she had personally cleaned and maintained, a prep table scrubbed white as bone, and shelves that she had organized with the same quiet ferocity she applied to everything in her life that she could control. She was in the kitchen at 9:30 that morning, working through the prep for the evening meal. She was planning a beef and root vegetable stew, as the cold had come in hard overnight, and men who worked outdoors in October in Nevada wanted warmth above all else, when she heard the saloon doors swing open with the particular heavy authority of someone who was not accustomed to doors stopping them. She did not look up from her cutting board. People came and went in the Silver Spur at all hours, and it was none of her business. She diced 3 turnips and began on the carrots, listening with half an ear to the ordinary sounds of a saloon morning. Dalton moving behind the bar, the scrape of a stool, the clunk of a glass. Then Dalton said, in a voice she had never heard from him before, a voice that was somehow both careful and uncertain, the voice of a man who has just realized he may not be the largest thing in the room. "What can I do for you, friend?" And the stranger said, "I am looking for a woman named Eliza Caldwell." Eliza set down her knife. The voice was deep, the kind of deep that seemed to come from somewhere below the chest, and it was measured and unhurried, the way mountain air is unhurried, the way things are unhurried when they have no reason to rush because they are already exactly where they belong. It was not a threatening voice. It was not a soft voice either. It was simply a voice that occupied its space completely and left no room for doubt. She untied her apron, folded it over the prep table, and walked out of the kitchen. He was standing at the bar. That was the first thing she registered, and then immediately understood why Dalton had sounded uncertain, because this man standing at the bar was not a man you processed casually. He was enormous, not in the way of fat men or even of tall men alone, but in the way of a thing built for hard use over a long time, layered and solid and absolutely without waste. He stood perhaps 6 feet and 3 inches, and his shoulders filled the space between him and the man on the next stool the way a mountain fills a valley, simply and completely. His arms were bare from the elbow down, rolled up against the cold in what seemed to be simple habit rather than comfort, and the forearms that emerged from those rolled sleeves were roped with muscle and darkened from years of sun. He wore a heavy canvas coat that hung open, and beneath it a flannel shirt the color of pine bark, and his trousers were buckskin, actual buckskin, not the cotton imitation, and his boots had seen enough miles that they had become almost sculptural in their worn character. His hair was dark brown, nearly black, and it fell past his collar in a way that was not unkempt but simply unfashionable. The hair of a man who spent more time in wilderness than in towns, and had made a certain peace with that fact. He had a short, dense beard that followed the strong line of his jaw, and his eyes, when they found her from across the room, were a gray-green like sage after rain. He was perhaps 32, 33 years old, maybe 34. The outdoors had written its usual ambiguous biography on his face. Weathered, yes, but the bone structure beneath was clean and strong, and the eyes were sharp in the way of a man who has spent years reading landscape and weather and the intentions of animals and people with equal precision. Eliza stopped in the doorway between the kitchen and the saloon floor and looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them spoke for a moment that lasted just long enough to feel significant. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, and it was not a question. He had found who he was looking for. "That is me," she said. "Who are you?" "My name is Caleb Horne," he said. "I knew your husband. Thomas and I rode together for a season, years back, before he came west and settled. I was sorry to hear of his passing." He said that last part with a simplicity and directness that Eliza found she preferred enormously to the elaborate condolences people had been offering her for over a year, the tilted heads and the soft voices and the carefully constructed sentences. He had been sorry. He said so. That was the whole of it. "How did you know Thomas?" she asked, coming to stand at the bar, not beside him, but at a deliberate distance, close enough for conversation, far enough to assess. "We were fur trappers together up in the Wind Rivers, Wyoming territory, back in 68 and 69, Caleb said. "He was a good man, steady, knew how to work hard and how to be quiet, which are the 2 qualities that matter most when you're spending a winter above 8,000 feet. The faintest suggestion of something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but its near relation. "He used to talk about you. Said he had a woman back in Missouri who had more courage in her little finger than any man he had ever met." Eliza's chest tightened in the particular way that grief tightens things, without warning, without mercy, pressing on the very center of you until the air feels thin. She did not let it show on her face. She had become very good at that. "What brings you to Cold Creek, Mr. Horne?" she asked. Caleb reached into the inside breast pocket of his canvas coat and produced a folded letter. He placed it on the bar between them. "I received this 4 months ago. Took me some time to get down from the mountains and across the territory. I came as soon as I was able." He paused. "I need to explain that before anything else. I came as soon as I was able." Eliza looked at the letter. She recognized the handwriting immediately, and her breath left her in a quiet rush, because the hand that had written that letter was Thomas's hand, and Thomas had been dead for 14 months. She picked it up slowly. It was dated 3 weeks before his death. Thomas had written to Caleb Horne at an address in Wyoming, care of a trading post, knowing that letters to trappers moved slowly and might take months to find their mark. He had written 2 pages in his careful, deliberate hand. Thomas had always written the way he spoke, with economy and precision, and what he had written was this: that he was in debt, that he was worried, that the land was harder than he had anticipated, and the mortgage was a weight he was not sure he could carry, and that if something happened to him, he wanted Caleb to know about Eliza and the boy, because Caleb was the best man he had ever known, and Thomas trusted him the way you trust the person who has kept watch while you sleep in dangerous country. He had not asked Caleb to do anything specific. He had simply trusted him with the information, the way you trust a good man with anything that matters to you, knowing that good men find their own way to what needs to be done. Eliza read the letter twice, standing at the bar of the Silver Spur, with Reed Dalton pretending very hard to be busy at the far end. When she finished, she set it down carefully, smoothed it with her palm once, and looked at Caleb Horne. "He wrote to you 3 weeks before he died," she said. "Yes." "Did he think something was going to happen to him?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, and she understood that the quality of that silence was consideration, not evasion. "I think Thomas was the kind of man who prepared," he said finally. "I do not think he knew, but I think he felt the weight of things, and he did what he could to manage them." Eliza nodded once. That was Thomas, exactly. That was the most Thomas thing she had ever heard anyone say about him. "Thank you for bringing this," she said. "It was a long way to come to deliver a letter." "I did not come only to deliver a letter," Caleb said. And then, before she could ask what else he had come for, he reached back into that same breast pocket and produced a second item, a folded piece of paper, this one crisp and official-looking, sealed with a dark wax impression, and set it on the bar beside the letter. "What is that?" Eliza asked. "That," said Caleb Horne, "is a bank draft, drawn on the First Bank of Elko, where I deposited the proceeds from my last 2 seasons of trapping and guiding. I've been speaking to Mr. Dalton this morning before you came out." He glanced briefly at Reed Dalton, who had abandoned all pretense of business and was now watching this exchange with the fixed attention of a man watching a card game whose outcome affects him personally. "Mr. Dalton has agreed to show me every note and ledger entry pertaining to any debt you carry in this establishment. I would like to purchase every one of them." The silence that followed was absolute. Eliza heard the wind press against the saloon's front wall. She heard the distant sound of a hammer from somewhere down the main street. She heard her own heartbeat, which had gone quite strange. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Your debts," Caleb said, with that same unhurried steadiness. "Whatever you owe here, I want to pay it. And I have also spoken with Aldous Greer at the land office this morning. I was in town for an hour before I came here, and he has agreed to discuss the matter of your mortgage arrears. I want to settle those as well, if you will permit it." Eliza stared at him. She was not a woman who was easily staggered. She had delivered a foal alone in a blizzard. She had nursed Thomas through a fever that had gone on for 11 days one February. She had identified his body in the undertaker's back room and chosen the wood for his coffin and managed every detail of his burial without allowing herself to fall apart until Henry was asleep and the house was dark and there was no one left to be strong for. She was not easily staggered. She was staggered. "Why?" she said, and the word came out with considerably less composure than she would have preferred. Caleb Horne looked at her with those sage and rain eyes and said simply, "Because Thomas trusted me with what mattered most to him, and I have not yet found a reason not to honor that." Reed Dalton, who who had apparently decided that this was the most interesting thing to happen in the Silver Spur since the incident with the mule in August of last year, produced his ledger book from beneath the bar and set it on the counter with a small thump that seemed to say, "Shall we proceed then?" Eliza looked at the ledger. She looked at Caleb Horne. She looked at the letter from Thomas lying there on the bar with its creased familiar handwriting, bridging a gap of 14 months and an entire life with quiet insistence. "Mr. Horne," she said carefully, "I do not know you." "No," he agreed, "you do not. And you are proposing to pay a stranger's debts." "I am proposing to pay the debts of the wife of a man I called my closest friend," he said. "Whether that makes you a stranger or something else is a question I suppose we will have to figure out." Eliza Caldwell, who had not cried in front of another living person since the morning after Thomas's funeral, pressed her lips together very firmly for exactly 2 seconds. Then she reached across the bar, opened the ledger and said, "Show me what you intend to pay." What followed was the strangest 90 minutes of Eliza's life, which was saying something considerable given the life she had lived. She sat at one of the eating tables with Caleb Horne and Reed Dalton, and they went through every line of the debt ledger item by item, with Eliza verifying each entry and Dalton explaining his accounting with unusual transparency. Caleb had a way of looking at a man when he spoke that made dishonesty seem like an extraordinarily poor idea. And by the end of it, they had accounted for $51.70, which Caleb paid in coin and bank draft without the smallest visible hesitation. Dalton wrote a receipt. He wrote it twice, in fact once for Caleb and once for Eliza, and he did it with a thoroughness that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with having it on the record that a mountain man had just walked in and paid down what Dalton had privately considered an ongoing and very convenient arrangement. Eliza accepted her copy and folded it with both hands and put it in the pocket of her gray wool dress. When Dalton retreated to the far end of the bar and began doing something unnecessarily loud with glassware, Eliza looked across the table at Caleb Horne and said, "You should not have done that." "Probably not," he agreed pleasantly. "I was managing." "I know you were," he said. "That was very clear." He said it without condescension, which surprised her. Most men said things like that with a particular tone that was only 3 or 4 degrees removed from pity, and pity was the thing Eliza Caldwell least wanted from any person on earth. But Caleb said it the way you might say that a horse is well trained or a fence is well built, with actual respect for the effort behind the fact. "So why intervene?" she asked. Caleb leaned back in his chair, which protested quietly under his weight, and looked at the table for a moment before looking back at her. "Because managing and thriving are different things," he said, "and Thomas's boy deserves more than managing. Henry." The mention of Henry, even obliquely, did something to the careful architecture of Eliza's composure. She steadied it by focusing on the practical. "You intend to go to the land office next," she said. "If you will come with me," he said. "It is your land. You should be present for every conversation about it." She studied him for a long moment. The morning light through the saloon's narrow front windows was thin and silver, and it lit the side of his face with an honesty that artificial light never quite managed. The weathering around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the particular stillness of a man who was not performing patience but actually possessed it. "All right," she said, "I need to get my coat." The walk to the land office took them down the length of Cold Creek's main street, which was 3 blocks of uneven wooden storefronts and the particular combination of mud and manure that characterized every western town in October. Eliza walked beside Caleb and was aware, with an almost clinical precision that surprised her, of how different the street looked with him in it. He moved through the town the way a large, confident animal moves through unfamiliar terrain, alert but unworried, taking in everything without revealing that he was doing so. People noticed him. Men who would ordinarily occupy the full width of the boardwalk shifted slightly without seeming to understand why. Aldous Greer at the land office was a small man with ink-stained fingers, and the permanently slightly alarmed expression of someone who has spent too many years dealing with people in financial distress and has come to expect catastrophe from every interaction. He looked at Caleb Horne, and then at Eliza, and then back at Caleb, and something in his expression recalibrated. The conversation about the mortgage took 45 minutes. Caleb had done his homework. In the brief time he had spoken to Greer that morning, he had established the total arrears and the outstanding principal, and he had come prepared. He paid the arrears, $38, in full, and he arranged with Greer for a formal restructuring of the remaining mortgage payments that would reduce the monthly burden to something Eliza could manage on her own income. He did not take the mortgage from her entirely. Eliza noticed that. He did not sweep in and eliminate the debt as though erasing her from the picture. He reconfigured it so that she remained its holder, its owner, the person responsible for and benefiting from her own land. It was a distinction that seemed small from the outside and felt enormous from where Eliza was standing. When they left the land office, the sun had climbed to its modest October height, and the street was filling with the midday activity of a working frontier town. Freight wagons, horses at hitching posts, the sound of the blacksmith 3 streets over, the smell of wood smoke and autumn dryness. Eliza stopped on the boardwalk outside the land office and turned to face Caleb Horne. "Mr. Horne," she said, "you have spent a considerable sum of money this morning on behalf of a woman you have never met." "I met you approximately 3 hours ago," he said, with that not-quite smile again. "You know what I mean," she said. "I do," he said. He looked at her steadily, and she had the strange sensation of being read, not unpleasantly, of being looked at by someone who was actually looking, not performing the motions of attention. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm going to say something now that you will almost certainly think is absurd. I am asking you to hear it out before you respond." Eliza folded her hands in front of her. "All right." "I'm 33 years old," he said. "I have spent the last 12 years in the mountains and the wilderness, and I have found that life to be rich in certain ways and entirely empty in others. I have enough in savings, even after this morning, to buy land, build a proper house, and establish a working farm in this valley. I have been thinking about doing that for 2 years, and I have been finding reasons not to, and I believe the reasons I have been finding are the wrong kind of reasons, which is to say they are the reasons of a man who is afraid of something and calling it independence." He paused. "Thomas's letter arrived 4 months ago, and it told me about a woman who had more courage than any man he had ever met, and about a boy who deserved a father, and about a situation that was not fair and that I had the means to address." Another pause, shorter this time. "Mrs. Caldwell, I would like to ask your permission to call on you properly, if you are willing. I am not asking for anything else. I am asking to be known by you, and to know you, and to see whether what I am thinking is something that makes sense." Eliza looked at him for a long time. The wind moved between them, lifting a strand of her dark auburn hair across her cheek, and she did not push it away because she was too occupied with thinking. "You want to court me," she said. "Yes," he said, "with your permission and at whatever pace you require." "You paid my debts and now you want to court me," she said, not as an accusation, but as a piece of accounting, making sure all the figures were correct. "I paid your debts because it was the right thing to do and I had the means," he said. "Those are the only reasons. The courting is a separate matter entirely, and I want to be clear about that, because I will not have you thinking that I purchased anything that a person cannot purchase." Something moved in Eliza's chest. It was not grief this time. It was something that had been dormant for a very long time, something careful and half-remembered and frightening in its fragility, the way new ice on a pond is frightening when you know how cold the water is beneath it. "You will need a place to stay," she said. "The boarding house on 2nd Street is run by Clara Hollis, and she keeps a clean establishment and a fair price." Caleb nodded. "I will find it. And Mr. Horne," she added, as he moved to go. He stopped. "Henry," she said, "he is 5 years old and he lost his father and he's the most important person in the world. If you are going to be in this town and near this family, you will need to understand that before anything else." "I understand it," he said, and the way he said it told her that he meant it with his whole self, not just the part of himself that was trying to impress her. "Come to supper on Friday evening," she said. "The farmstead is 3/4 of a mile east of town on the Millfield Road. Henry will be there." The walk back to pick up Henry from May Briggs's house afterward was the strangest Eliza had made in a very long time. She felt like a person who had been walking in darkness and suddenly noticed that the darkness was less absolute than it had been. Not light, not yet, but the faintest possible lightening at the edge of a horizon that had been entirely black for 14 months. She did not trust it. She was too practical for that, and too bruised. But she noted it. Henry, when she collected him, had spent the morning teaching May Briggs's elderly tabby cat to perform what he described as tricks, which appeared, from the cat's expression, to be more in the nature of deeply resented cooperation. He tucked his small hand into Eliza's as they walked home and told her about the cat with the passionate detail of someone who has discovered a great truth, and Eliza listened and made the appropriate sounds of interest and felt the weight of the morning settling into her bones with a quality that was different from the weight she usually carried. This weight had something hopeful in it. She did not entirely know what to do with that. Friday arrived with a sky the color of pewter and a wind that had gone from brisk to serious overnight, which was the Sierra Nevada's way of announcing that winter was no longer a prediction, but a fact. Eliza spent the afternoon cooking. She made roasted prairie chicken with a pan sauce of dried herbs and the apple cider vinegar she kept in the cold cellar, and cornbread, and a pot of dried bean soup that had been going since morning and had reached the stage of deep, rich warmth that made a small house feel like the most generous place on earth. Henry knew a visitor was coming. Eliza had told him simply that a man who had been friends with his papa was coming to supper, and Henry had received this information with the measured gravity of a 5-year-old processing something that was both interesting and slightly too large for him, which resulted in a series of very precise questions delivered at intervals throughout the day. What kind of friends? What did friends eat? Was the man bigger than the blacksmith, and could he come inside the house or only the barn? "He can come inside the house," Eliza said, stirring the bean soup. "Does he have a horse?" Henry asked. "I do not know," Eliza said. "You could ask him." Henry considered this important assignment and returned to the wooden horse he was carving with Thomas's old penknife. She had allowed him this because Thomas had given it to her, and she thought it mattered for Henry to have something of his father's in his hands. Caleb arrived at 5:30, just as the last light was leaving the sky and the temperature was dropping with the decisive abruptness of high-altitude evenings. He knocked at the door rather than calling from outside, which was the kind of small courtesy that Eliza noticed and filed away. He had his canvas coat on and his hat in his hands when she opened the door, a good brown felt hat that he had clearly acquired since coming to town because it was too new for a trapper, and he was carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth that he held out to her. "Honey," he said, "from a bee tree I found up near the pass last September. I carried it down in the pack. I thought your son might like it." Eliza took the bundle and felt the heft of it, a full jar sealed with wax, golden amber even through the cloth wrapping. She looked up at him. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with a specificity that went beyond the honey. She stepped back from the door to let him in, and he had to duck slightly for the lintel. Thomas had built this house to his own dimensions, and Thomas had been a good 2 inches shorter than Caleb Horne, and then he was inside, filling the small front room with his size and with the cold outdoor smell of him, pine sap and autumn air and wood smoke. Henry was sitting at the small table with his wooden horse, watching Caleb with the completely unfiltered assessment that children perform and adults spend their whole lives trying to recover the ability to do. He watched him for a solid 10 seconds and then said, "You are the biggest man I have ever seen." Caleb looked at Henry with an expression that was warm and direct and completely without the patronizing softness that some adults deploy around children, as though children are a different species requiring special handling. "I have been told that before," he said. "You must be Henry." "Yes," said Henry. "Do you have a horse?" "I do," said Caleb. "A bay mare named Augusta. She's at the livery in town tonight because it is too cold to leave her tied outside." Henry processed this with great seriousness. "Is she a good horse?" "She is the best horse I have ever ridden," Caleb said, "and I have ridden a considerable number of horses." Henry nodded slowly, as though this answer had passed some internal verification. "I'm making a horse," he said, holding up the carved figure, which was recognizable as a horse primarily through Henry's evident commitment to the idea. "It does not look like a horse yet, but it is going to." "Can I see?" Caleb asked. "Not, 'May I see? Let me see. I will tell you how to do it better.' But can I see, as a request and nothing else?" He crossed the room to the table and crouched down to Henry's level and looked at the wooden figure in Henry's hands with genuine attention, and Henry showed him where the neck was and where the legs were going to be, and Caleb said that it looked like it was going to be a very fine horse, and said it in a way that made it clear he was not flattering but actually looking. Eliza stood in the kitchen doorway and watched this, and felt something large and quiet shift in her chest like a river stone settling in a current. Supper was the best meal Eliza had made in a long time. She could tell it was good even as she cooked it, the way you sometimes can when everything aligns right, the heat and the timing and the quality of the ingredients. They sat around the small table, the three of them, and ate in the way that people eat when the food is genuinely good and the company is not yet entirely comfortable, but contains the promise of becoming so, with attention to the meal as a way of managing the newness of each other. Henry ate with the focused enthusiasm of a boy who has been working hard all day and is rewarded by food that exceeds his expectations. He had 3 pieces of cornbread. Eliza made a mental note of this for future reference. Caleb ate with the appreciative seriousness of a man who has spent years eating what he could catch or carry and understood deeply that a meal like this was a form of civilization in the best sense of the word. "This is the best meal I have had since I was 16 years old and my mother was still alive," he said, setting down his fork with a kind of reverence. "Where are you from originally?" Eliza asked. "Vermont," he said. "My father was a farmer. I came west in '61 and never went back." "Vermont," she repeated. She thought about the distance from Vermont to the Wind River Range of Wyoming to Nevada, the arc of a life moving always toward something farther and wilder, and wondered what had driven it, and whether she would ask him about it someday. 61 was a hard year to come west. The war was beginning. "That was part of why I went," he said simply. He did not elaborate and she did not press, because there were many kinds of reasons a young man of 1861 might leave the East, and not all of them were simple. Henry, who had been following this exchange with the alert attention of a child who knows the adults are talking about important things, said suddenly, "My papa is dead." The table went very quiet. "I know," Caleb said, without the horrified over-gentleness that adults usually deployed when Henry said this. The thing that made Henry uncomfortable, Eliza knew, because he had told her once that people got a strange face when he said it. Caleb said it the same way he said everything, directly, with respect for the weight of the fact. "Did you know him good?" Henry asked. "I knew him well," Caleb said. "He was my best friend for 2 winters. We kept each other warm and kept each other alive up in the mountains of Wyoming, and a man who has done that with you is a man you do not forget." Henry looked at his cornbread. "I miss him," he said. "Of course you do," Caleb said. "He was worth missing." Henry looked up then with those dark Thomas eyes, and something in his face settled, some tension that Eliza recognized as the tension of a child who has been told complicated things about grief by well-meaning people, and simply wanted someone to agree with the plain fact of it. After supper, Caleb helped clear the table, which Eliza would not have predicted and did not ask for, moving in the small kitchen with a surprising economy of motion for a man his size. Henry fell asleep in the chair by the fire. He always fell asleep in the chair by the fire and always woke up indignant about it the next morning when Eliza transferred him to his bed. And Eliza and Caleb sat at the cleared table with tin cups of coffee and the particular quiet of a house where a child is sleeping. "He is a remarkable boy," Caleb said. "He is very much like his father," Eliza said. "The steadiness. Thomas was the steadiest person I ever knew." She paused. "I used to be frightened by that early on when we were young. I thought steadiness was the same as coldness. I did not understand yet that it was actually the opposite." Caleb looked at her across the table. "What changed your mind?" "The winter of '69, she said. "Henry was born in December of that year, and there were complications, and Thomas sat beside me for 36 hours, and never lost his steadiness once. And I understood then that it was the most loving thing I had ever seen anyone do." She said it without particular emotion, simply as a recorded fact, the way you describe a landscape you have crossed and know well. "Thomas was right about you," Caleb said. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "He wrote that you had more courage than any man he had ever met," Caleb said. "Sitting across from you right now, I'm inclined to agree with him." Eliza felt the heat rise in her face and was annoyed by it. She had not blushed in years, and the experience was disconcerting. She looked at her coffee cup. "I'm not particularly courageous," she said. "I simply do what needs doing." "That is what courage is," said Caleb Horne. He left at a proper hour, and she stood in the doorway and watched him walk down the road toward town with his long, unhurried stride, his shoulders broad against the dark and the stars burning hard and cold above the valley. And she stayed in the doorway longer than the cold really warranted. The weeks that followed had a quality that Eliza would later find difficult to describe, as though the whole world had shifted slightly on its axis, and now the same landscape contained different things. Caleb stayed at Clara Hollis's boarding house and began, with a quiet, methodical efficiency that reminded Eliza of Thomas's steadiness, but was also entirely its own thing, to establish himself in the valley. He purchased 40 acres of land 3 miles north of Eliza's farmstead, adjacent to the creek that still ran in the lower valley even when the upper reaches had gone dry, and he began the work of clearing it and planning a house. He came to call on Eliza twice a week, on Tuesday evenings and Sunday afternoons after church, and each time he came, he brought something. Not always a gift in the conventional sense, not flowers or ribbons or the things that a courting man in a town might bring, but practical things carried with a specific attention that made them feel like more than practicality. A good piece of cured leather for risoling boots, a bundle of dried medicinal herbs for the kitchen shelf, a book. He had found it at the general store, a battered copy of a collection of poems that he left without comment and which Eliza read by firelight 3 nights running. He came to supper regularly, and he was consistent with Henry, not trying, not performing, simply present and reliable in the way that a child who has lost a parent most needs the adults in his world to be. He taught Henry to whittle properly, sitting on the porch one Sunday afternoon in the thin November sunshine, his enormous hands guiding Henry's small ones on the penknife with a patience that never frayed and never over-explained. He talked to Eliza. This was what surprised her most, or perhaps not surprised, but arrested. He talked to her not as a woman he was managing or charming or selling something to, but as a person whose thoughts he was genuinely interested in. He asked her about Missouri, about her family, about how she and Thomas had made the decision to come west, and he listened to the answers with a quality of attention that felt rare and serious. He told her about his own years in the mountains, the solitude that had been nourishing at first, and then slowly, over time, like a diet missing some essential thing, had begun to leave a particular kind of hunger that wilderness could not fill. One Tuesday evening in late November, with the first real snow of the year beginning to fall outside the farmstead's small windows and Henry asleep in his room, Eliza and Caleb sat at the kitchen table, and Caleb told her about the man who had shot Thomas. He said it quietly, with a care for how the words would land, and Eliza put down her coffee cup and listened. He had done his own investigating, he said, in the weeks between his arrival in Cold Creek and this evening. He had spoken to people, the sheriff who had inherited a cold case from his predecessor and was not exactly burning to reopen it, the men who had found Thomas's horse, a prospector who worked the eastern foothills and saw most of what moved through that territory. What he had pieced together was this. Thomas had encountered 2 men from a syndicate that had been attempting to claim the land rights to several small farmsteads in the valley, using intimidation and forged paperwork as their primary tools. And Thomas, being steady and firm in the way that made him either admirable or inconvenient, depending on your interests, had refused to sell and had told them he intended to report their paperwork to the land office. They had shot him. One of those men was now in a Nevada territorial prison on an unrelated charge of fraud. The other had moved south, destination unknown. Eliza listened to all of this, and when Caleb was finished, she was quiet for a long time. So it was not random, she said finally. No, he said. It was not random. It was because he would not be moved. Eliza pressed her hands flat on the table. That steadiness of Thomas's, the thing she had come to understand as love, had gotten him killed because some men could not stand the thing that would not move when they pushed it. She was not surprised, not really. The world was exactly that unjust, and had always been. But there was a difference between knowing something abstractly and knowing it with the specific detail of it sitting before you at a kitchen table in a snowstorm. "Is there anything to be done?" she asked. "The man in prison will not be getting out for a long time," Caleb said. "And I have reported what I know to the territorial marshal's office about the second man. That is as far as the law will reach." He paused. "It is not enough." "No," she said, "it is not enough. but it is more than I had yesterday." She looked at him. "Thank you." He held her gaze and said nothing, and she thought, this is what steadiness looks like when it is not Thomas's, but is still recognizable, still the same quality of a thing that does not move under pressure. She said, before she could decide not to, "I am glad you came to Cold Creek, Caleb." It was the first time she had used his name, and they both heard it. "So am I," he said, and the words were simple, but the weight behind them was not. He was building his house. He had purchased lumber and supplies from the mill in Elko, a day's ride east, and had hauled them back on a rented freight wagon over 2 trips. The frame went up in the first week of December, with help from 3 men from town, the carpenter James Reeves and 2 brothers named Colville who did general labor around the valley. Eliza went to see the progress one afternoon, bringing Henry in a basket containing lunch, and stood at the edge of the cleared lot watching the skeleton of the house rise against the white and gray of the winter sky. It was going to be a good house. She could tell even in its unfinished state. The proportions were generous. 3 rooms on the ground floor, a sleeping loft above, a covered porch running the full length of the front. Caleb had thought about it, she could see. He had not built the smallest functional house he could manage. He had built what would eventually be a home. Henry scrambled around the foundation with the joyful abandon of a child in a space that contains excellent things to climb on. And Caleb walked with Eliza and showed her what was planned. Where, the kitchen here, the front room there, the way the windows would be positioned to catch the afternoon light that came from the southwest in winter. He explained it all without flourish, just the facts of the building, and Eliza listened and asked practical questions about the range and the root cellar and the water supply, and they spoke about these things the way 2 people speak who are imagining the same future without yet having said so out loud. December deepened and the snow came in earnest. The Sierra Nevada to the west vanished into cloud and the valley filled with the particular quiet of a landscape under heavy snowfall, the muffled and absolute silence that turns the world into something clean and simplified. Eliza hauled water and cut wood and cooked and cared for Henry and walked the 3/4 of a mile into town for her work at the Silver Spur, which she had not yet left because the income was still necessary, and because she had not yet figured out what the next stage of things would look like. Caleb came by one snowy afternoon when the temperature had dropped to the point where her breath fogged before her face indoors and found her struggling with a piece of split wood that had wedged itself into the chopping block at a bad angle. He crossed the yard, took the axe from her without a word, freed the wood with one clean movement, and then spent the next hour splitting the rest of the pile while she watched from the porch with her arms crossed and her chin up, trying to decide whether to be grateful or annoyed at the ease of it. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, not breaking his rhythm. Each swing was precise and complete, the axe head finding the grain of the wood with an accuracy that spoke of 10,000 repetitions, and the muscles of his back and shoulders moved under his flannel shirt like something architectural. "I was managing," she said. "You were," he agreed. "You were also losing the argument with that last piece." "I would have won eventually," she said. "You would have," he said, "but your hands are getting cold." She looked down at her hands, which were indeed red and stiff with the cold, and she could not come up with a reasonable counter-argument to this observation, so she went inside and put the kettle on instead and told herself that finding someone useful was not the same as needing them, except that was not quite true, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. The thing she had been afraid to name had been growing through all of October and November, and now December, like something planted in dark soil that sends up shoots before the light is quite ready for it. It was not just gratitude, though gratitude was certainly there. It was not just comfort, though he was comfortable to be near in a way she would not have predicted. He had a quality of stillness that made the air around him feel less pressured, as though his sheer solidity took something pressured out of the world by occupying space that anxiety might otherwise have claimed. It was that she wanted to talk to him. It was that she was aware, on the days when he did not come, of his absence the way you are aware of a missing stone in a wall. Not catastrophic, the wall still stands, but the gap is there and you know where it is. It was that he looked at her, had from that first morning, like a person seeing another person and finding the sight entirely worthwhile. She was afraid of this. She was afraid because Thomas had been the person she built her life on, and the ground had opened under that, and she had nearly not survived it, and the idea of putting weight on anything again was terrifying in the precise physical way that heights are terrifying. Not irrational, actually entirely rational, because you know what falling feels like now. But she was also 31 years old, and she had Henry, and she had a farmstead, and she had apparently not entirely stopped being the kind of woman who was capable of want. And these things were also true. 2 days before Christmas, Caleb came to the farmstead with Augusta, his bay mare, loaded with a fresh-cut pine tree that he had found in the foothills and tied across the horse's back with a rope. He wrestled it into the front room and set it in the bucket of sand that Eliza's mother had always used to hold Christmas trees. And Henry, who had never had a Christmas tree before because Thomas had not believed in the extravagance and Eliza had always been too tired, went absolutely incandescent with joy. They decorated it with what they had, a string of dried berries that Henry strung with enormous concentration, a few pieces of scrap ribbon, 3 small candles in tin holders that Eliza had found at the general store. Caleb watched Henry work with an expression on his face that Eliza was beginning to recognize as the specific look he got when something moved him, but he was not going to say so, the contained warmth of a man who feels things fully and expresses them carefully. When Henry finally went to bed, exhausted and luminous with Christmas feeling, Eliza sat in her chair by the fire, and Caleb sat across from her in the other chair that he had taken to occupying, and the tree was between them with its 3 small candles lit, and the house was very quiet and very warm. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. She had been composing this for a week, the way you compose a letter you keep rewriting because none of the drafts feel adequate to the thing they are trying to say. She had been over it from every angle, and she still did not have clean, well-organized words for it, so she said the plain thing instead. "I do not know how to do this," she said. "I do not know how to let someone in again. I know that is not your problem to solve, and I am not asking you to solve it. I am only telling you because you have been entirely honest with me since the morning we met, and I want to be the same kind of honest with you." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow was falling again, soft and steady. "I know," he said. "I have not been asking you to know how. I'm just here." "I know you are," she said. And then, more quietly, "That is the thing I'm trying to tell you, that I know you are, that it matters." He leaned forward in his chair and rested his forearms on his knees and looked at her with those steady, sage-green eyes. The firelight moved across his face and caught the angles of it, and he was not a handsome man in any conventional and effortless way, but he was deeply, arrestingly real, the face of a person who has been fully present in his own life and been marked by it. "Eliza," he said, and her name in his voice was different from anything else. "I am not going anywhere. I have 40 acres of land and a half-built house and a plan to farm this valley for the rest of my life. I am not asking you to hurry. I am asking you to know that I am not going anywhere." She looked at him across the space between the chairs, across the small lit tree with its dried berries and ribbon and 3 candles, across the 14 months of managing alone and the lifetime of being her own particular kind of strong, and she thought, "I believe you. I actually believe you." She said, "It is good to not be alone anymore. I did not know how heavy it was until just now." He reached across the distance between them and took her hand, not with urgency or heat, but with a gentleness that was almost startling in someone so physically large, and held it for the remainder of the evening while the fire burned down and the Christmas tree glowed and the snow fell outside and the house held them both in its warmth. January was hard. January in Cold Creek, Nevada was always hard. This was a fact of geography and climate that no amount of hope could alter, and the winter of 1873 to 1874 was particularly determined. The temperature in the valley dropped below 0 for 11 days running, and the snow accumulated to depths that made travel difficult and provisioning a constant concern. Eliza's woodpile, despite Caleb's contributions, required daily replenishment, and she could feel the cold pressing at the house's seams. Henry got sick on the 4th of January, a chest cough that developed into something deeper and more worrying by the second day, the kind of sick that had taken children in this valley before, and that Eliza knew about with a cold and specific fear. She dosed him with the willow bark tea and the mustard plaster, and sat up through the second night with him while he breathed with the difficult, labored quality of someone fighting hard at close quarters, with something they cannot quite see. Caleb arrived on the third morning, having noticed from the road that the farmstead smoke was constant and the shutters still closed past the time Eliza would ordinarily have opened them. He knocked, and she came to the door with her hair unbraided and dark circles under her eyes, and he looked at her face and did not ask. He came inside, took off his coat, and sat with Henry for the rest of the day, leaving at intervals to bring in wood and to heat water and to manage the 10,000 small tasks of a household under siege, and Eliza was able to sleep for 4 hours while he kept watch. She woke to find him at the table with Henry sitting up beside him, still pale and weak, but clearly over the worst of it, working very slowly on the wooden horse again, while Caleb talked to him in a low, continuous voice about the mountains, about the elk that moved through the high meadows in September, about the way the light hit the peaks in late afternoon, about the time he had shared a camp with a prospector named Old Charlie, who had 13 cats and played a fiddle made from a tin can. Henry was listening with the soft, recovering attention of a sick child being carried back toward wellness by the sound of a good story, and Eliza stood in the bedroom doorway and watched the two of them and felt something so large and so specific move through her that she had to press her hand to her mouth. This was what she had not known she was waiting for. Not the rescue, not the paid debts or the fixed mortgage or the split wood, though all of those things mattered, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But this, a man who stayed, who showed up not in the grand moments, but in the cold, exhausted, frightened, ordinary ones, and who sat with a sick child and told him about mountain cats and a fiddle made from a tin can until the child's breathing evened out and the color came back to his face. She went back to the kitchen and made soup, and did not let Caleb see that she had been crying, which was easy because she had become very good at the logistics of private weeping over the past 14 months. February arrived, and the cold relented by 5 degrees, which in the context of the valley might as well have been a standing ovation from the sky. Caleb's house progressed through the interior work that could be done in winter. The rough floor laid, the chimney and range installed, the windows fitted. He took Eliza to see it one Sunday in mid-February, and it was different now, with 4 walls and a roof over it, the skeleton filled in and plastered and smelling of fresh lumber and new mortar. She walked through the rooms while he watched her from the doorway, and she ran her hand along the windowsill of the front room, feeling the quality of the work, careful and solid, and stood in the kitchen and looked at the range and the prep shelf and the place where a table would go. "It is a good house," she said. "It is going to be," he said. She turned to look at him. He was leaning in the doorway, had to lean slightly because the doorframe was just at his height, and his arms were crossed, and he was watching her with the look she knew well by now, the contained warmth that he had, and something in the quality of the moment felt like a question. "Caleb," she said. "Yes," he said, not a question, an acknowledgement. He was listening with his whole self. "I think," she started, and then stopped, because the words required more courage than she had expected, which was annoying because she was supposed to be a courageous woman. She tried again. "I think I have been falling in love with you since Christmas," she said, "and I have been trying not to, and I am not making very much progress." The silence that followed was very brief and very full. Then Caleb Horne came off the doorframe and crossed the room to her in 3 long steps and stood before her, enormous and real, and looking at her with those gray-green eyes that had been steady from the beginning. Steady as a mountain, steady as good timber, steady as a man who has decided and does not change his mind without reason. "I have been in love with you since October the 9th, he said, "since the moment you walked out of that kitchen and looked at me like you were going to assess me fairly and show me no more mercy than I deserved." Something broke open in Eliza's chest, broke open in the good way, the way ice breaks open in spring on a river that needs to run. He raised one hand, the big rough hand of a man who has worked hard in cold country for 12 years, and touched her face with a gentleness that was so careful and so complete that it was almost unbearable, and she looked up at him and thought, "I am not going to be afraid of this. I have been afraid of enough things. I am done being afraid of this." She put her hand on his chest over the warmth of him and felt his heart beating steady and strong beneath her palm, and he bent down and kissed her, and it was not tentative and not rushed, but exactly the right temperature. the way a fire is exactly the right temperature when the kindling has finally caught fully and the real burning has begun. When they separated, she stayed close to him, her hand still on his chest, and he rested his forehead against her hair, and they stood in the unfinished kitchen of the house he was building and breathed the same air for a long moment. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. "All right," she said. "I want to ask you properly," he said, and she felt him shift, and when she stepped back he was on one knee on the rough wooden floor, which given his size was a gesture that had a certain majestic absurdity and also a complete and devastating sincerity. He took her hand in both of his. "Eliza Caldwell," he said, "I'm 33 years old, and I have spent 12 years learning every way to live except the right one. I want to build a life here in this valley with you and with Henry, and I want to do it properly, with your consent and your partnership and your complete and absolute equality in it. I do not want a woman who follows me. I want a woman who walks beside me, and that is what you are and what you have always been." He paused, and she saw in his face the rare thing, the crack in the steadiness, the evidence of feeling too large to be fully contained by even his particular composure. "Will you marry me?" Eliza looked at him for a moment, this enormous, careful, honest man on his knee on her floor, and thought of Thomas, thought of the letter, thought of all the ways the world had broken and all the ways it had, against reasonable expectation, offered something worth building again. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He rose from the floor in one smooth motion and took her in his arms, and she wrapped her arms around him, and the warmth of him was like stepping inside after a very long cold, and she put her face against his shoulder, and he held her with his whole considerable strength, and she thought, this is the feeling of not falling. This is what it feels like when you put weight on something and it holds. They were married in March, when the snow was beginning its retreat, and the first tentative green was showing in the lower meadows where the sun hit the south-facing slopes in the long afternoons. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Aldridge at the Calvary Church on Cold Creek's First Street, with the church full, fuller than it had been for any service in recent memory, because Eliza had been in this valley for 6 years, and people had watched her carry 14 months of widowhood with a dignity and a backbone that had earned her the kind of respect that a small frontier community gives quietly but sincerely. Henry stood beside Eliza in a new shirt that Caleb had bought him at the general store, a real store-bought shirt, dark blue flannel, which Henry wore with the solemn pride of someone in ceremonial garb, and he was given the specific duty of carrying the 2 rings, which he had practiced several times that morning with intense seriousness. May Briggs was in the front pew and cried with the full commitment of a 70-year-old woman who has been waiting for something good to happen to Eliza Caldwell for a considerable time. James Reeves the carpenter was there, and Clara Hollis from the boarding house, and even Reed Dalton was present in the back row, wearing his good vest and the expression of a man who is not accustomed to being moved by public sentiment, but finds himself briefly outmaneuvered by it. Eliza wore her good dress, the dark green wool, the one she had bought in Sacramento the year before everything fell apart, the one she had been saving for a reason, and her hair was down and pinned with 2 small combs that had been her mother's. And she stood before Reverend Aldridge and looked up at Caleb beside her and felt the specific clarifying certainty of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be. Caleb said his vows in the same way he said everything, directly, with conviction, with the absolute absence of performance, and when Reverend Aldridge pronounced them married and Caleb kissed her, Henry said, at full 5-year-old volume, "That's a long time to kiss," which moved the entire congregation to laughter so warm and complete that it filled the church like sunlight through the new spring windows. They moved into Caleb's house 2 weeks after the wedding, once the last of the interior work was complete, and the furniture had been arranged and the kitchen shelf had been stocked, and Eliza's good iron range from the farmstead had been transported and installed beside Caleb's newer one, because she had decided early in the planning that a proper household needed 2 ranges, and Caleb had agreed with the simple directness of a man who understands that a woman who cooks the way Eliza cooks is an authority on the subject of ranges. The farmstead they kept, leasing the land to a young family named Dupree, who had come from Iowa with 4 children and not enough money, which Eliza arranged on terms that were generous enough to give the Duprees a real chance. The mortgage was fully paid off by summer. Caleb's farming income and what he had retained from his trapping savings combined carefully and deliberately, And Eliza burned the last payment receipt one evening in the front room fire with a feeling of completion so thorough it was almost ceremonial. Spring became summer, and summer in the Carson Valley, which lay just below Cold Creek at the foot of the Sierra Nevada, was extraordinary in the way that spring in the mountains is extraordinary. Everything green and extravagant after the restraint of winter, the creek running clear and cold, the meadows full of wild grass and the particular dry sweetness of high-altitude summer air. Caleb planted 20 acres in his first season, a mix of grain and vegetables and a kitchen garden that he put in right outside the kitchen window so Eliza could step out the door and cut herbs and greens without having to cross the yard, which she thought about every single morning when she did exactly that and found herself unreasonably happy about. Henry thrived. Children do when the ground under them becomes steady, when the adults around them are fundamentally all right. They absorb security the way they absorb everything else, through proximity and repetition and the slow accumulation of ordinary safe days. He started with reading that spring, working through the primer that Eliza had brought from Missouri. And by summer he could read a simple page and was profoundly proud of this ability, demonstrating it at every opportunity. He followed Caleb around the farm with a devotion that was completely unself-conscious in the way that only a child's devotion can be, learning the names of tools and the habits of the horses and the particular vocabulary of agricultural work that Caleb was patient and thorough in teaching him. One evening in July, Caleb and Henry came in from the evening chores together, both of them covered in the particular honest dirt of a long day's outdoor work. And Henry was talking without pause about something he had seen in the upper field, a red-tailed hawk hunting the grass edges. And Eliza watched them come through the door together, and Henry had Caleb's old canvas hat on his head, enormously too large for him, pushed down over his ears, and Caleb was looking down at him with the expression that was no longer contained warmth, but simply warmth, fully expressed, because somewhere in the months of knowing Henry, he had stopped being careful about showing what he felt for the boy. She turned back to the stove before either of them saw her face, which had done a complicated and entirely involuntary thing. That night, after Henry was asleep and the dishes were put away, and the house was settling into its nighttime creaks and quiet, Eliza sat on the porch with Caleb in the warm July dark, and she told him that she thought she might be expecting. She said it the way she said difficult things, directly, watching his face. His face did what it rarely did. It abandoned its composure entirely. He looked at her with an expression that was so open and unguarded that she almost looked away, because it was the kind of nakedness that you feel slightly as though you are intruding upon, even when it is directed at you. "Are you certain?" he said. "Not entirely," she said, "but mostly." He reached for her hand in the dark and held it and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "How are you feeling?" It was such a fundamentally Caleb thing to ask. Not "are you happy?" Not "how wonderful?" But "how are you feeling?" First and most important, that she laughed, which surprised her. "I feel fine," she said. "Tired, but fine." She paused. "Happy," she added, and felt the word in her mouth like something you have been looking for in a drawer for a long time and have finally found exactly where it was supposed to be. He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed it once, and then kept holding it, and they sat on the porch in the warm July dark, listening to the creek below the field and the nighthawks calling in the high air above the valley. And Eliza thought, "I am happy. I am actually, structurally, fundamentally happy. Not the performance of it, not the management of it, but the real thing." The real thing had been something she had not been entirely sure she would find again. The baby was born in March of 1875, exactly 1 year after the wedding, which was the kind of timing that Reverend Aldridge, when he heard it, called God's arithmetic, and which May Briggs, when she heard it, called considerably more straightforwardly satisfying. It was a boy, a solid, loud, red-faced boy, who announced his arrival with a volume that startled the house, and who Henry, when he was brought in to meet his brother, studied with the intense analytical expression of someone who has received a gift that is more complicated than expected. They named him Thomas. Caleb had suggested it, and Eliza had said yes before he finished the sentence, and afterward she had to leave the room for a few minutes, which Caleb understood completely and gave her without question. Thomas Horne came into the world with his father's dark coloring and his grandfather's stubborn appetite, and the particular quality of presence that the name suggested. He was from the first entirely and emphatically himself, filling whatever space he occupied with the warm and slightly overwhelming completeness of a fire that is caught properly. Henry regarded him with a shifting mixture of skepticism and possessiveness that gradually, over the first months, resolved entirely into devotion. By the time Thomas could sit up on his own, Henry had appointed himself the primary authority on Thomas's well-being and comfort, a role he performed with a conscientiousness that made Caleb say to Eliza one evening that Henry was going to be either a doctor or a foreman, and probably both. Life on the farm established its rhythms. Caleb's first full farming season had been good, not spectacular, nothing so dramatic as that, but solid and productive in the way of well-prepared ground and hard work, and some good luck with the weather. The grain came in well, the kitchen garden exceeded even Eliza's considerable expectations, and Augusta the bay mare proved herself not only an excellent riding horse, but an equally excellent working horse, which Caleb had always suspected and was now confirmed. In the autumn of 1875, they acquired 2 more horses, a pair of grays he bought at the auction in Elko, strong-backed and sensible, and a small herd of cattle that gave the farm an additional income stream through the following year. The house expanded modestly with a second sleeping room off the back, built by Caleb over the course of the summer with help from James Reeves, and Eliza planted roses along the front porch because she had always wanted roses, and this was the first time in her adult life that she had been in one place long enough to know they would still be there to bloom for her. They bloomed the following spring with a red extravagance that she came to the porch every morning to look at, and she stood there with her coffee in the early light and the roses around her and thought about the Missouri farmhouse where she had grown up, which had also had roses along the front, her mother's roses, and how she had not thought of that in years because there had been no roses to remind her. Memory is like that, she thought. It waits in the specific places where it lives and rises when called by the right thing. She thought of Thomas often and always would. Thought of him with love and grief in the proportion that they settle into after enough time, which is not equal, but which is livable. Grief present, but no longer occupying the whole of the space. She thought of the letter he had written to Caleb, that careful, deliberate letter that had traveled from Nevada to Wyoming and back again, and had arrived in the Silver Spur on a cold October morning in the form of a mountain man with sage-green eyes and a leather satchel full of coin. She thought about the particular intelligence of it. Thomas had not asked for anything specific, had simply trusted Caleb with what mattered, knowing a good man when he knew one. She had told Caleb this one evening what she thought about it, and he had listened carefully and then said, he trusted the right person with the right thing. He said it without false modesty, not deflecting the compliment but accepting it cleanly, the way he accepted most things. He trusted you specifically, she said. He knew you would come. He knew I would try, Caleb said. Whether I could or not, he could not have known. He knew, she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then I'm glad I did not let him down, he said. Henry turned 7 in the late autumn of 1875 and celebrated this fact with the seriousness of someone crossing a significant threshold. He had, by this point, developed into a reading person. There was no other way to describe it. It was not simply that he could read, but that he read constantly, with the absorbed intensity of a child who has discovered that the inside of a book is larger than the outside, which is the essential discovery. Caleb had brought back 3 books from a supply run to Elko in the summer, and Henry had read all 3 by October, including one that was considerably more advanced than his age would have suggested, a natural history of the American West that he studied like a text of sacred significance. Caleb found this delightful. He and Henry would spend Sunday evenings talking about what Henry had read, Caleb adding his first-hand knowledge of the landscapes and animals described, Henry adding the theoretical framework that the book provided, and the conversation between them having the quality of 2 people who simply find each other genuinely interesting, which is the best kind of conversation. Eliza would sit nearby and sew or read her own book and listen, and sometimes contribute, and feel the particular warmth of a house in which the people inside it are not merely coexisting, but actively enjoying each other's company. In the spring of 1876, a complication arrived in the form of a letter from the Territorial Land Office, a formal inquiry regarding the original title to Eliza's farmstead, which she had transferred to the Dupree family, but retained a residual interest in through the lease arrangement. The inquiry referenced a claim by someone named Harlow, representing a land syndicate, to prior rights over 3 properties in the valley. The letter was formal and opaque in the way of official documents, but what it meant, stripped of its bureaucratic covering, was that the same people who had killed Thomas were trying again through legal channels this time, using the slower and more respectable violence of paperwork. Eliza read it twice, and then gave it to Caleb. Caleb read it once. Then he said, "I am going to Elko," in a tone of voice that was perfectly calm and carried within it the quality of a natural feature, a cliff face, a granite wall, that does not move regardless of what is applied to it. "I am coming with you," Eliza said. "I expected nothing less," he said. They rode to Elko together, leaving Henry and Thomas in May Briggs's capable charge. May Briggs, who was now 73 and claimed to be only getting started, and spent 2 days in the territorial offices working through the documentation with a land lawyer named Patterson, who was sharp and thorough and who confirmed, after examining the original title paperwork, that the Harlow claim was based on a document that was almost certainly forged, just as Thomas had suspected 2 years before he died. Patterson filed a formal counterclaim with supporting evidence and wrote a letter to the Territorial Marshal's office referencing the original investigation into the forgery syndicate. And when they rode back to Cold Creek 3 days after they had left, the matter was not entirely resolved but was firmly in motion, the kind of motion that bureaucracy, once set in the correct direction, tends to maintain. The Harlow claim was dismissed by the Territorial Court in August of 1876. Eliza received the notice and carried it directly to the small box where she kept Thomas's photograph and Henry's first tooth and the letters that mattered, and she placed it on top of everything else and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment with the box open on her lap. Thomas had been right. He had seen it clearly and he had stood against it, and it had cost him everything. And now, 3 years later, the thing he had refused to yield had been defended and held. She closed the box. She went back to the kitchen. She made dinner. Caleb found her that evening at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, not reading, just sitting with the particular quality of stillness that meant she was processing something large. He sat across from her. "It is done," she said. "Yes," he said. He would have been glad, she said. He would have, Caleb agreed. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He would have been glad about all of it. She looked at him across the table, across the lamplight, across the 3 years of things that had built between them. The ordinary and the extraordinary, the sickness and the harvest, the arguing about the position of the second horse corral, and the quiet evenings on the porch, and the nights when Thomas had cried in his sleep, and she had gone to him, and Caleb had been already awake, already listening, already present. "So am I," she said, "glad about all of it." He turned her hand over and held it properly, the way you hold something precious, and she looked at him and thought, this is what it is. Not the grand gesture, though the grand gesture had been grand and she would always remember it, the morning in the Silver Spur, the leather satchel, the quiet, deliberate way he had said he wanted to buy every debt she owed. But not only that. It was this, the Tuesday evenings and the Sunday mornings and the watching over Henry in the night and the riding to Elko and sitting across the kitchen table when something large needed to settle. This was the architecture of a life built together. This was what Thomas had trusted Caleb to provide, because Thomas had known what kind of man Caleb was, and Thomas had been right. Autumn came to the valley with its amber cottonwoods and its hard light and the smell of wood smoke rising from every house in Cold Creek, and the mountains above went white at their peaks, while the valley floor stayed golden for a little while longer, holding on to the last of the warmth the way you hold on to a thing you know is valuable. Henry started at the Cold Creek School that fall, a one-room schoolhouse run by a young teacher from Pennsylvania named Miss Elkins, who recognized within the first week that Henry was the kind of student who required material slightly more demanding than the average, and who handled this by giving him additional work and, on several occasions, simply handing him a book and saying, "Read this and tell me what you think." Henry found this arrangement entirely satisfactory. Thomas, at 18 months, had developed opinions, strong, specific, loudly expressed opinions, primarily regarding the consumption of cornmeal porridge, the hours of napping, and the exact level of proximity to the horses that he considered acceptable, and that Eliza considered acceptable, which were not the same level. He had Caleb's gray-green eyes and Eliza's auburn hair and Thomas Sr.'s stubborn jaw, and the combination of these things produced a child of devastating personal force who was going to be an extremely interesting adult to know. Caleb handled Thomas with the same patient consistency he handled everything, not breaking, not bending, simply being larger and steadier than whatever the storm was. And Thomas, like all small storms, tended to exhaust itself against something that did not respond to intensity and eventually discover that cooperation had advantages. In the winter of 1876, they had an evening that Eliza returned to in her memory for the rest of her life. It was a December evening, the same deep, quiet cold as the December when Caleb had first come to supper. They had gone through the year's accounts together after Henry and Thomas were asleep. The farm was in the best financial position it had ever been. The second season had been better than the first. The cattle had performed well. The mortgage on the homeland was 2/3 paid down. And Caleb had looked at the numbers for a long time, and then looked at her with an expression that was quieter than his usual quiet. "Thomas, your Thomas, he would have liked this valley," he said. "I've been thinking about that lately. He would have been good at this." Eliza considered the truth of this. "He would have," she said. "He had the patience for it. Farming is a patient man's business." "He had more patience than almost anyone I knew," Caleb said. "He was afraid of it too," she said, which was something she had never told anyone, not even her parents, not even May Briggs. "He was afraid of this very thing, of the debt, of the mortgage, of failing you and Henry and me. He would not have said so, but I knew." She paused. "That is why he wrote to you, not only because he trusted you, but because he was frightened and he needed to do something with the fear, and the only thing Thomas could do with fear was convert it into action." Caleb was quiet for a long time. "I am glad he did," he said finally. "I am glad he did not carry that alone." "He could not carry things alone," she said. "That is why he needed me, and why he needed you." "And you?" Caleb said. "Can you carry things alone?" "I can," she said. "I proved that for 14 months. But I do not want to anymore." She looked at him. "That is the difference, I think, between managing and choosing. I managed before. Now I am choosing." He reached across the table and she met him halfway, and they held hands across the account books and the lamp flame, and the house around them was full of the breathing quiet of children asleep, and a farm at rest, and a life that had been built on hard ground and had held. Henry grew. Thomas grew. The farm grew. The roses came back every spring, redder and more established each year as their roots went deeper into the Nevada soil, and Eliza cut them sometimes and put them in the blue glass vase on the kitchen table. She had found the vase at a peddler's wagon in the summer of 1876 and had spent 50 cents on it, which she did not regret for a single day. And the kitchen in the morning with the roses and the light through the south window, and the sound of the farm waking outside, was the specific image of happiness that she would carry forward through every difficulty that came after. And difficulties did come, because that is the nature of things. A late frost in the spring of 1877 that damaged half the grain planting and required replanting at considerable cost and effort, an illness in the cattle herd that they managed to contain before it spread but which cost them 4 animals, and several weeks of anxious vigilance, the particular and grinding difficulties of a small frontier farm operation, attempting to be financially solvent in a market that was always unpredictable and sometimes cruel. Caleb met these things as he met everything, with steadiness and method, and the absolute refusal to be larger in his worry than in his action, which was the quality about him that Eliza had come, over years of close observation, to consider his defining characteristic. He was afraid sometimes. She knew because she had learned to read him, had learned the slight deepening around his eyes and the particular set of his jaw when he was processing something difficult. But his fear never translated into either paralysis or cruelty, which were the two things fear most commonly became in people who had not learned to manage it. He was afraid for her, especially when in the spring of 1878 she told him she was expecting again. He was afraid in the specific way of a man who knows that women die in childbirth on the frontier, with a frequency that no level of love or provision can reduce to zero, and she saw it in him, and she addressed it directly, because she was Eliza Caldwell Horne, and she had never learned to be indirect with things that mattered. "I am healthy, and I am strong, and I'm going to be fine," she said. He looked at her. "You cannot know that." "No," she said. "But I have good reason to believe it, and I am going to believe it, and I need you to believe it with me, because we are better at almost everything when we do it together." He breathed out slowly. "All right," he said. "All right." He was present for the entire labor, sitting outside the bedroom door through the long hours of it, ready to come in if needed, and respecting the space of May Briggs and the midwife Clara Vane, who had established herself in Cold Creek the previous year, and who was brisk and competent and entirely unsentimental in the way that good midwives are. And Eliza was right. She was strong and she was healthy, and the labor was long but uncomplicated, and the child who arrived in October of 1878 was a girl. She had Caleb's eyes and Eliza's hair and the particular expression of someone who has arrived somewhere and is taking stock of the territory, which was appropriate. They named her Margaret for Eliza's mother and called her Maggie from the first day, and Maggie settled into the household with the assurance of someone who knew she was expected and was pleased to find her expectations confirmed. Henry, at 9, was fascinated by her. He observed her with the same quality of focused curiosity he brought to the natural history books, as though she were an interesting natural phenomenon. Thomas, at 3, was initially uncertain and then rapturously devoted, bringing her objects of interest with the earnest frequency of a person offering tribute. Caleb held her on the first morning, standing by the window with the October light on both their faces, and Eliza watched him from the bed and saw in his face a completion, the specific expression of a man who has arrived at the place he was supposed to be and knows it without needing it to be different from what it is. "Hello, Margaret," he said to the infant in his arms, with the directness he applied to all introductions. "You are going to be all right. All of you are going to be all right." He was speaking, Eliza understood, to more than just Maggie. The years settled. 1879 came and went in grain and cattle and cold winters and summers that smelled of dry grass and pine. Henry at 10 was reading at a level that had exceeded Miss Elkins's curriculum, and Caleb had begun writing letters to various institutions. He was thinking about the future, about what education might look like for a boy with Henry's particular intelligence and appetite. Thomas, at 4, was learning to ride with the natural balance of a child born to it, which delighted Caleb and alarmed Eliza in roughly equal measure. Maggie, at 1, was walking, lurching, determined, refusing all assistance, and saying several words with such confident authority that no one was ever quite sure she meant what she seemed to mean, but acted on it anyway, to be safe. On a Sunday afternoon in the late spring of 1879, Caleb and Eliza sat on the porch after church, the way they had come to do on Sunday afternoons, the children playing in the yard below, the roses in full red bloom along the porch rail, the valley spread out below them, green and gold in the long afternoon light. Caleb was quiet in the comfortable way that had no anxiety in it, watching his children in the yard, his arm along the back of the porch bench, with Eliza tucked against his side, and Eliza was thinking about nothing specific, which was itself a luxury that she had not always had access to, and that she now recognized as the particular texture of a life in which the immediate crises are managed and the future is not something to be feared. "What are you thinking about?" she asked him. "I was thinking about October of 73, he said, "walking into the Silver Spur, seeing you walk out of the kitchen." She smiled against his shoulder. "You were very forward," she said. "I was terrified," he said. "I had ridden 500 miles on a letter from a dead man, and I had no idea what I was going to find." "What did you find?" she asked, knowing the answer but wanting to hear him say it. "The most remarkable woman I have ever met," he said, "standing in a kitchen doorway with flour on her apron and murder in her eye, deciding whether I was worth trusting." A pause. "I was extremely motivated to be worth trusting." "You were," she said. "I had good material to work with," he said. She looked out at the children. Henry at the far end of the yard lying on his stomach in the grass with his book, Thomas making circuits of the yard on his small legs with some kind of wooden implement extended before him like a flag, Maggie sitting in a patch of sun with extraordinary focus, pulling up fistfuls of grass and examining each one. The mountains were still white at their peaks, and the sky was the particular high-altitude blue that she had come to think of as Nevada's best feature, the blue that was not the humid, soft blue of the east, but something harder and clearer and more permanent. "I used to think the worst thing that ever happened to me was Thomas dying," she said, "and for a long time it was. For a long time it was simply the largest fact of my existence." She paused. "Now I think it is more complicated than that." "How so?" he said gently. "Because if he had not died, you would not have come," she said. "And I know it is not right to say that one thing justifies another, especially when the thing is what it is. But I also cannot look at this life, this specific life, and wish it away." She paused again. "Thomas sent you to me," she said. "I know that sounds a particular kind of way, but I believe it. He knew what he was doing, and he trusted you with the most important things in his world. And you came and you honored that in the fullest possible way." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "He sent me a letter," he said. "I made choices after that." "I know," she said. "Both things are true." He pulled her closer against his side, and she felt the steadiness of him all the way through, that quality she had identified and marveled at from the beginning, now so familiar and so entirely necessary that she could no longer imagine the specific texture of the air without it. Below them, Thomas had apparently arrived at some destination with his wooden implement and was announcing this fact to Henry at considerable volume. Henry did not look up from his book. Thomas escalated. Henry turned one page. Maggie watched this with the expression of someone taking notes for future reference. Eliza and Caleb watched their children in the Sunday afternoon of their Nevada valley, and the roses were red around them, and the mountains were white above them, and the farm was green below them. And all of it was theirs, not in the simple sense of ownership, but in the deeper sense of things that have been built and fought for and earned, things that exist because people decided to make them exist and kept deciding every ordinary and extraordinary day to keep going. The Silver Spur still stood on Main Street in Cold Creek, and Reed Dalton still served whiskey behind its scarred bar. And sometimes, when Eliza passed it on her way through town, she thought about October the 9th, 1873, and the morning the world had cracked open like sun-baked earth and offered something unexpected through the crack. She never went past it without feeling something, not nostalgia exactly, and not gratitude alone, but the particular and serious acknowledgement of a person who has been given a second chance and understood what it was in time to do something with it. Caleb sometimes came to town with her on those errands, his long stride beside hers on the muddy or dusty or snowed-in Main Street of Cold Creek, and occasionally they stopped for a moment in front of the Silver Spur, not going in, just stopping, and she would look at the swinging doors and the narrow windows and the faded paint of the sign, and he would look at her looking at it, and sometimes he would say something and sometimes he would not, and both were fine. One morning in the spring of 1880, he said, out of the quiet in which they were standing, "I think I would like to buy it." She turned to look at him. "The saloon?" "Dalton has been trying to sell for a year," he said. "He is getting old and his knees are giving him trouble, and his son in Sacramento keeps writing to him to come and live there." He looked at the building. "I would not keep it as a saloon. I would convert it. The space is good bones, as the carpenters say. I think it could be a proper eating establishment. The valley needs one." Eliza looked at the building. She thought about the kitchen behind the bar, her kitchen, really, in the years she had spent there, and the back room with the eating tables, and the large open space of the saloon floor that could, with removal of the bar and the card tables and the addition of some proper furnishings, be something entirely different. "It is a good idea," she said. "I would want you to run it," he said. "The food side of it, you would need to hire kitchen help and you would need to train them, and you would be the authority on what was served and how. I would manage the business side." She was quiet for a moment, thinking about it in that particular rapid way she had. The logistics, assembling themselves in her mind almost involuntarily. The range placement and the menu and the staffing and the sourcing of ingredients. "You would need a reliable supplier for the beef," she said. "We can provide that ourselves from the farm, but not at full scale. We would need the Benson Ranch as well." "Benson has already spoken to me about a supply arrangement," Caleb said. "Last fall." She turned to look at him. He had the not-quite smile. "You have been planning this," she said. "I've been thinking about it," he said carefully. "I have not been planning it. I would not plan something like this without you." She looked back at the Silver Spur. She looked at the sign and the doors and the windows and thought about all the mornings she had come through those doors with her apron over her arm and her ledger in her pocket, managing, making it work, finding the dignity in work that was not what she had planned, but was what there was. And she thought about what it would mean to walk through those doors in a different capacity, not as a woman working off a debt, but as a proprietor, an authority, a person whose name was on something. "Yes," she said. "Buy it." He did. The purchase of the Silver Spur from Reed Dalton was completed in June of 1880, and Dalton left for Sacramento in August with enough money to keep his old age comfortable, and the expression of a man who is somewhat astonished by how things have turned out. The conversion took the fall and into winter. James Reeves and his crew again, tearing out the bar and the card table infrastructure, laying a proper floor, building a real kitchen with a second range, and a cold room, and the prep space and storage that Eliza had drawn out on paper in careful detail. It opened in March of 1881, which happened to be exactly 6 years after the day Eliza and Caleb were married, and the establishment was called, after a long and sometimes heated discussion in which several more elaborate names were considered and rejected, simply Caldwell's, which was Eliza's suggestion, and which Caleb accepted without argument because it was exactly right. Caldwell's was full on its first evening and had a waiting list by its second week, and it established itself as the definitive eating establishment of the Cold Creek Valley within its first month, because the food was exactly as good as the food Eliza Caldwell had been making since she was old enough to stand at a stove, which was extraordinarily good, and the atmosphere was warm and well managed, and the prices were fair. And in 1881, in a Nevada valley full of miners and ranchers and farmers and their families, and the occasional traveler on the road between Elko and Carson City, a warm place with excellent food and fair prices was not a small thing. It was, in fact, a very large thing. Henry, now 11, helped in the establishment on busy evenings, seating guests and carrying water with the focused competence of a child who takes seriously any task assigned to him. Thomas, at 6, was mostly prevented from helping, but succeeded in being present through a combination of persistence and charm. Maggie, at 2.5, was entirely helpful in her own estimation and primarily constituted a fascinating hazard in the kitchen from Eliza's. Caleb managed the front of house and the business accounts with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to the farm, and in the evenings after closing, he and Eliza would sit together at the table in the back office, which had once been the storage room of the Silver Spur and was now a proper small office with a writing desk and 2 chairs and a lamp, and go over the day's accounts the way they had always gone over the farm's accounts, together side by side, both of them knowing the numbers and both of them making the decisions. It was, Eliza thought, the most functional partnership she could imagine, not because there were no disagreements. There were. They were regular and vigorous and occasionally loud, but because the disagreements happened between 2 people who respected each other's judgment and arrived at conclusions through actual negotiation, rather than one person simply deciding and the other accommodating. Caleb deferred to her on food and service. She deferred to him on supply negotiations and capital decisions. Everything else they worked out every time together. Autumn of 1881. Henry turned 12 and had by this point thoroughly exhausted the educational resources of Cold Creek, a fact that Miss Elkins acknowledged with a mixture of pride and relief, and the correspondence Caleb had been conducting with the Nevada State University in Reno, newly established, serious in its intentions, a genuine institution of higher learning growing in the territory's capital, resulted in a letter indicating that Henry would be considered for enrollment in 4 years' time when he reached 16, and that in the meantime, a preparatory curriculum could be arranged through correspondence. Henry received this news with the expression of someone who has been told that the horizon they have been walking toward is in fact approachable. Thomas was 7 and in school and reading with great competence and farming with greater enthusiasm, having appointed himself Caleb's primary assistant in the working of the fields, in a way that required regular management of his expectation that his 7-year-old body could perform the same work as his father's adult one. Caleb managed this by assigning him tasks that were both real and scaled appropriately, which satisfied Thomas's dignity while preserving his structural integrity. Maggie was 3 and entirely herself in every available moment, and Eliza stood in the kitchen of Caldwell's on an October morning in 1881, 8 years after the morning Caleb Horne had walked through those same doors with a satchel of coin and changed the direction of her life, and she was making the beef stew that was the establishment's most popular dish, and that she had made essentially unchanged since she had perfected it in the kitchen of the Silver Spur in the autumn of 1873. And the morning light was coming through the new kitchen windows, and the fire under the range was exactly right, and the smell of it was deep and rich and good. And she thought, this is the whole of it. Not the debt payment or the proposal or the wedding or any single moment, but all of it together. The whole accumulation of ordinary and extraordinary days, the stew and the accounts and the roses and the children and the man who had walked in off the mountain and stayed. She heard the back door open and close, and then Caleb was in the kitchen, having come from the early morning at the farm to help with the delivery of the day's supplies, and he was large and real and slightly cold from the October air, and he came to stand behind her at the range and bent his head to look over her shoulder at the stew. "That is the best smell in the world," he said, which was what he said every time, and she felt him close and warm behind her. "You say that every morning," she said. "Because it is true every morning," he said. He put his hands on her shoulders, the warm, heavy, comfortable weight of them, and she leaned back against him briefly before returning to the stove because the stew required attention and this was a kitchen. "Caleb," she said. He said. "I think I might be expecting again," she said, with the same directness she always brought to difficult announcements. There was a pause. Then she felt him laugh, not the contained, not quite smile, but an actual real laugh, surprised and warm. And he turned her gently from the stove and looked at her with those gray-green eyes that had first found her in the saloon doorway 8 years ago, and that she had been finding every day since to contain exactly what she needed. "Are you happy about it?" he asked, which was the first thing he always asked. "Very," she said. He kissed her in the kitchen, with the stew on the stove and the morning light coming through the new windows and the sound of Cold Creek going about its October business outside, and it was not tentative and not performative, but simply the kiss of two people who know each other completely and find each other, still after all the ordinary and extraordinary days, entirely worth finding. The fourth child was born in the spring of 1882, a boy as solid and determined as all the Horne children seemed to arrive, and they named him William for Caleb's father, and William settled into the family with the easy confidence of someone joining an enterprise that is clearly going well. Henry left for the Nevada State University in Reno in September of 1885, packed onto the stage with a trunk that contained 4 books and a change of clothes and the wooden horse, finally recognizable as a horse, that he had been working on since the age of 5. The morning of his departure, Caleb stood on the main street of Cold Creek and shook his hand, man to man, because Henry was 16 and that was what was appropriate, and then pulled him into a brief, complete embrace, and Henry held on for a moment before stepping back. And there was a look exchanged between them that Eliza, watching from nearby with Thomas and Maggie and William gathered around her, recognized as the look of two people who have built something together over a long time and know its value and intend to protect it across whatever distance intervenes. Henry Caldwell would become a doctor. Not immediately. It took 12 years and a great deal of determination, and the steady, unfailing support of a family in Cold Creek that wrote letters and sent money and believed without reservation in the fact of him. But he would get there, and he would come back to the Carson Valley and practice for 40 years and be the man that the valley had needed since before he was born. But that is the future, and the future is not what this story is about. This story is about an October morning in 1873, when a mountain man walked into the Silver Spur Saloon with a leather satchel full of coin and a letter written by a dead friend, and a widow walked out of a kitchen doorway with flour on her apron and the look of a person deciding whether a thing was worth trusting. It is about the debt that was paid and the greater debt, the one that cannot be entered in any ledger, that was offered freely and accepted with the whole self. It is about a man who came down from the mountains and decided to stay, It is about a woman who had been managing alone for 14 months and discovered that choosing was better. It is about a boy who needed to be told that his father was worth missing, and a little girl who pulled up fistfuls of grass with the seriousness of a scientist, and a valley under a Nevada sky so blue it seemed like an argument for the possibility of good things. It is about Thomas Caldwell's last act of faith. The letter, written 3 weeks before his death to the best man he had ever known, trusting that man with the most important things in his world, and the way that faith moved through time and distance and grief to land exactly where it was supposed to land. Caleb Horne had spent 12 years learning how to live in the wilderness, and had learned it so well that he had nearly forgotten there were other kinds of living. Eliza Caldwell had spent 14 months managing alone and had proven she could do it indefinitely, and had discovered, in the same moment she walked out of that kitchen doorway, that indefinitely was not what she wanted. The saloon changed. The farmstead held. The roses came back every spring. And in the evenings, when the children were asleep and the books were put away and the accounts were settled and the farm was quiet under whatever season held it, 2 people sat on a porch or at a kitchen table or by a fire, and they talked about the things that matter and were quiet about the things that do not. And the house around them was full of the breathing life they had built together, and the mountains stood above it all in the clean Nevada dark, white-peaked and immovable, as they had always stood and would long after all of this. The love and the loss and the second chances and the roses had become the kind of story that people who come after us carry forward without knowing entirely where it came from. It came from a mountain man who walked into a saloon with a satchel full of coin and said he wanted to buy every debt she owed. It came from a widow who said, "Let me see what you intend to pay." It came from the particular courage of 2 people who were both, in their different ways, terrified, and who chose to be worth trusting every ordinary and extraordinary day for the rest of their lives.